The story begins in the depths of Kentucky's hills, an ancient brooding landscape where fog moves like a living thing, curling through the hollows and clinging to the timbered slopes. Here cabins rot back into the earth, their chimneys crumbling, their roofs collapsing beneath decades of rain and silence. And yet, there is one place, one clearing where the air feels heavier. Locals point to it even now, though few dare step closer. They whisper about a cabin that once stood there, its frame warped, its beams sagging, its doors nailed shut from the inside as if the walls themselves were trying to keep something trapped. Old men in Hazard, the nearest town, recall how strangers occasionally wandered too far into the hills, some hunters, a handful of traveling salesmen. All of them returned pale, unsettled. They spoke of seeing children on the ridge above the cabin, thin, wide-eyed, staring down without a word. Some said the children's voices carried through the trees, a strange hollow sound that echoed like a chant. Others swore the children's eyes didn't look right at all. The townsfolk never called them by name. Instead, they used a phrase that carried both fear and pity, the cursed bloodline. In coal country, where families already lived hard and poor, that name carried a special weight. It meant something worse than poverty. It meant shame that could never be spoken aloud. To outsiders, it sounded like backwoods folklore, just another tale whispered to frighten curious travelers. But for those who lived in the shadow of those hills, it was disturbingly real. Farmers warned their children not to stray near the cabin. Women walking home from church avoided the trail that led toward the ridge. And when a baby was born with a deformity in town, even if to a respectable family, someone would inevitably mutter under their breath, "Blood like that." It comes from the hills. One retired sheriff, interviewed decades later, recalled the cabin as a place you just didn't go. He admitted he had only been there once, in the 1950s when a hunter went missing. The trees were quiet, he said, too quiet. No birds, no wind. The house looked empty, but I felt watched the whole time, like something inside those walls knew I was there. The sheriff found no sign of the missing man, but he never returned to that clearing. Few ever did. Still, the whispers never stopped. As years turned into decades, the cabin decayed into little more than broken boards and moss-covered stone. But the stories endured. Tales of children who never mixed with town kids, of women who never married outsiders, of a patriarch whose name had been erased, but whose presence still lingered like a shadow in the trees. And so the legend of the hidden bloodline began, not as a written history, but as something felt. A chill in the woods, a silence that pressed too close. The cabin may have collapsed, but its memory remained. A question hung over those hills like the fog itself. What really happened inside that house? He is remembered not by name, but by fragments, descriptions passed down in whispers, as if speaking him aloud might pull his presence back into the hills. The stories always begin the same way. A tall figure, broad shoulders, a man who seemed carved out of the same unforgiving rock as the mountains he ruled. His eyes, people said, were sharp and unrelenting, able to pierce fog and silence alike. "He looked at you like he already knew your sins," one elderly coal miner recalled, his hands trembling even decades later. "And you knew better than to look back." This was the patriarch. Not a mayor, not a preacher, not a landowner, but a king in all but title. His kingdom was a cabin hidden deep in Kentucky's hollows. His crown was silence and his throne was fear. Those who lived under his rule were not strangers, but his own sisters, women bound not by love but by blood and domination. Witnesses said the women carried themselves like shadows. They never spoke above a whisper, never lingered in town longer than necessary. One shopkeeper remembered how they came in pairs, clutching each other's arms, their faces pale and downcast. When asked about their children, they gave only nervous smiles as if rehearsed. Inside the cabin, life was far darker. Each birth blurred the lines of family until kinship itself became a knot too tangled to follow. A son could also be a nephew. A daughter might also be a cousin. With every child born, the bloodline twisted further, folding in on itself like a snake devouring its tail. Those who tried to make sense of it failed. Decades later, genealogists attempted to map the family tree using courthouse records, old census notes, and testimony from surviving relatives. What they found was chaos. Brothers listed as fathers, nieces mistaken for wives, birth dates erased or rewritten. One researcher compared it to trying to untangle a spider's web after it's already been burned. Yet in this chaos, the patriarch thrived. He had created a dynasty that belonged only to him. By keeping his family sealed off from outsiders, he built a world where his word was law, where no preacher could intervene and no sheriff dared to intrude. In his isolation, he believed himself untouchable, and perhaps in a way he was. To this day, no one knows his full name. Some say it was stricken from records on purpose. Others claim it was never written down at all, as if the hills themselves wanted to erase him, but even without a name, his shadow remains. It lingers in the half-buried stories of Hazard, in the fearful tone of elders who lower their voices when asked about him, and it raises a disturbing question. If a man could build an empire of silence in the heart of America, how many more remain hidden, their legacies buried in the fog of forgotten hills? They were shadows in their own town. When the sisters appeared at the market, they walked close together, heads lowered, eyes darting from side to side as if contact itself were dangerous. Neighbors remembered how quickly they moved, never lingering, never allowing conversation. A passing good morning was met with a nervous nod. Nothing more. It was as though a wall of fear stood between them and the outside world. Years earlier, people recalled, these same women had been different, vibrant, laughing girls who would sing on porches in the summertime. But something had shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. Their brother's grip closed around them like iron, reshaping their lives in ways outsiders could only whisper about. Some said he told them the family's survival depended on obedience, that beyond the forest, beyond their home, the world would turn against them if they ever spoke. Others believed it was simpler than that. Fear of his fists, his rage, his control over every breath they took. Inside the cabin, their identities blurred. Sisters became wives. Mothers became caretakers of children who did not even know how to name them properly. One neighbor swore she saw a girl, no older than 16, holding a baby that looked far too much like her. Another described the sound of lullabies drifting from the cabin late at night, voices layered together in uneasy harmony. By the time anyone counted, 18 children had been born. 18 small bodies carried into that cabin, raised under silence. None of them had birth records. None were enrolled in school. To the town, they were invisible. To the sisters, they were the weight of a legacy they could neither escape nor explain. Silence became more than just survival. It was inherited. The children, growing among whispers and half-truths, learned quickly that questions were dangerous. Who was your mother? Who was your father? These were not things they asked. One witness remembered a chilling detail. When a traveling doctor offered vaccinations for the children, the sisters stood at the doorway blocking his path, shaking their heads violently before shutting the door. Whatever fear lived inside them was stronger than the risk of disease, stronger even than the hope of saving a child. To this day, those who lived nearby argue over the truth. Were the sisters victims, crushed beneath a brother's control? Or had they convinced themselves that silence was devotion, that their suffering was somehow necessary, even holy? The line between loyalty and imprisonment blurred until no one could tell the difference. And the children, growing up in the shadows of secrecy, bore the mark of that silence more deeply than anyone else. Even now, decades later, former neighbors still wonder, why didn't they run? Why didn't they cry out for help? Were they too afraid, or did they believe in him? That is the question that lingers. A silence so complete, so unbroken, it demands to be remembered. As the number whispered in town, though no one ever truly knew, they appeared and disappeared like flickers of movement at the edge of the forest. The locals saw them rarely, faces pressed against the cabin's small windows, or darting between the trees when no one was watching. They grew up in isolation, the woods their playground, the cabin their prison. From a distance, neighbors could hear their laughter carried on the wind, but it was laughter stripped of innocence, high, sharp, and oddly unsettling. Some remembered hearing strange cries at night, sounds that seemed neither animal nor human. They described the noises as broken, as though something inside those children struggled to find words but failed. The marks of their origins were undeniable. Some of the children bore bodies twisted by inbreeding, spines curved unnaturally, limbs that bent where they should not. Eyes that drifted in opposite directions gave their faces an uncanny, almost haunted expression. Others seemed normal at first glance, running through the underbrush like any child might. But when spoken to, they stammered or remained mute, their mouths opening without forming words. A woman who lived down the road swore she once saw a boy, no older than 10, dragging his foot behind him as though it were lifeless. Another neighbor recalled a girl who stood motionless for hours on the edge of the property, staring blankly into the distance until her brother pulled her away. These sightings were brief, fleeting, and always unsettling, reminders of what was hidden in that cabin. Inside, their world was closed, sealed by fear and bound by blood. They knew no school, no church, no outsiders. Their cousins were their siblings. Their uncle was their father. Their aunts were their mothers. Family trees twisted into circles that suffocated identity itself. When travelers passed through the hills, some claimed to hear the children's voices carried from the cabin, strange chants or half-formed songs in the dark. A hunter remembered once hearing footsteps rushing around him in the woods, quick and light, yet when he turned, there was no one there. Only the sound of breathing, close but unseen. The scars these children carried were not just physical. Many never learned to read or write, their minds stunted in childhood. They grew in a cycle of confusion, obedience and silence, never knowing where the boundaries of family ended or began. Even the smallest ones, neighbors said, seemed to move with the same nervous energy as their mothers, glancing over shoulders, flinching at sudden sounds. Decades later, those who lived nearby still speak of them in hushed tones. The children of darkness, they are called. Some wonder what became of them, where they went when the cabin finally emptied, whether they survived at all. Others suggest they never truly left, that their cries still echo in the forest when the wind is right. But the most disturbing question remains unanswered. What future could there be for children born into such silence, such secrecy, such blood? The family in the hills was never invisible. Their shadows reached into town, into the dusty aisles of the general store, into the quiet murmurs at the diner. People noticed. They always noticed. Clerks remembered the rare visits, women with hollow faces who avoided eye contact, children whose mismatched features drew stares before their mother quickly pulled them close. The patriarch himself would stride in with a rifle slung across his shoulder, as though daring anyone to comment. And no one ever did. Transactions were quick, words clipped, silence heavy. Neighbors whispered afterward. They spoke of how some of the children walked strangely, how their eyes didn't focus right. They speculated about why the women never spoke above a whisper, why they always glanced nervously toward the door, as if someone was listening. Yet in those forgotten corners of rural America, whispers rarely became action. Fear was a constant. A coal miner who lived 2 ridges away recalled hearing gunshots echoing from the hills at odd hours. He swore the patriarch used the sound as a warning, a message to remind everyone that his reach extended beyond the cabin. Some said he was quick to violence, a man you didn't cross. His rifle wasn't a tool for hunting. It was an extension of his rule. But fear alone did not explain the silence. Poverty played its role. Life in those Kentucky hollows was hard, survival uncertain. People learned not to meddle in another man's household. Isolation was another factor. The cabin sat far enough into the woods that its horrors remained out of sight, easier to ignore than confront. And then there was superstition, an unspoken belief that disturbing such a family might invite a curse upon your own. So the town carried on. Farmers tended their fields, miners descended into the earth. Church bells rang on Sundays, and just beyond the tree line, the patriarch's kingdom thrived unchecked. Even when outsiders asked questions, locals grew evasive. A traveling salesman once inquired about the strange children he'd glimpsed along the road. The shopkeeper who served him simply shook his head and muttered, "Best not to ask." A schoolteacher, long retired, admitted she had seen one of the children briefly, a boy who seemed far too old to be so small, his clothes torn, his eyes vacant. When she pressed the family about enrolling him, the patriarch shut the door in her face. She never asked again. Complicity became the town's quiet pact. To acknowledge the truth would demand action. To act would invite danger. So they chose the safer path, turning away. Decades later, townspeople still struggle with that silence. Some defend it as survival, insisting they had no power to intervene. Others confess it was easier not to see, not to name what was happening just beyond the hills. But the most haunting question lingers. Did their silence make them bystanders? Or accomplices? By the time the third generation took its first breath in that cabin, the shadows had already begun to show in the children's bones. The bloodline, once hidden by secrecy and enforced silence, was breaking down in ways no one could ignore. Doctors, summoned reluctantly by desperate whispers, left the hills shaken. One physician from Hazard recalled a child born with a cleft palate, so severe he struggled to breathe. Another spoke of a girl whose hands were fused together, fingers melted into a permanent claw-like fist. Their reports circulated quietly, never written in official records, only murmured over coffee cups and behind locked doors. Medicine could diagnose but not heal what centuries of isolation had created. The patriarch, furious at any intrusion, barred doctors from entering his home. He was said to have met one physician at the door with a shotgun pressed firmly against his chest, warning that no outsider would ever dictate how his children lived or died. Word spread quickly, and soon most doctors refused to venture up the mountain at all. In their absence, the family turned to crude remedies. Poultices of crushed herbs, boiled bark teas, and whispered prayers were all that stood between sickness and death. But fevers ran unchecked, infections spread, and one by one small bodies were carried into the forest. There were no headstones, no coffins, just shallow mounds of earth marked by stones and wooden crosses that quickly rotted away. Locals whispered that those hills became haunted. Farmers claimed to see pale figures moving just beyond the tree line at dusk, children with twisted limbs and hollow eyes wondering where they had been buried. Hunters avoided the area, swearing that the air grew colder near the graves, that the forest itself seemed to mourn. The decay was not only physical but generational. Children who survived carried minds that never fully matured, locked in perpetual childhood, even as their bodies aged. School teachers, when pressed decades later, admitted they had encountered some of them, teenagers who could not read a word, who laughed or cried at odd moments, who struggled to understand the simplest of lessons. It was as if the weight of their ancestry pressed down upon their very thoughts. In town, suspicions hardened into unspoken truth. People knew what was happening in those hills. They had heard the stories, seen the children's faces, and read the fear in the women's eyes. Yet still they did not speak it aloud. Naming it would mean acknowledging a crime too monstrous to exist in plain sight. The cabin became a place of contradictions, life and death bound together. Births followed swiftly by burials, laughter cut short by silence. It was a kingdom of decay, collapsing inward on itself, and as the graves multiplied, one question began to haunt those who lived nearby. How long could a family like this survive before its secrets consumed it entirely? For decades, the cabin rotted into the hillside, swallowed by vines and silence. To the people of Hazard, it was easier to let the story fade into whispers. But time has a way of unearthing what should never have been buried. It began quietly, through scraps of court records that didn't quite make sense, birth certificates that named no fathers, guardianship papers that shuffled children between distant relatives, unexplained deaths recorded in uneven handwriting. Social workers combing through cases in rural Kentucky noticed the patterns. They spoke of children who arrived barefoot and malnourished, their accents so thick and garbled it was almost impossible to understand their words. One boy, remembered by a state worker, was found wandering along a dirt road with nothing but a torn shirt clinging to his back. His eyes were wide and restless, as though the very sight of strangers was unbearable. When they tried to question him, his speech collapsed into broken sounds, fragments of language that carried no meaning to the outside world. He seemed half feral, raised more by forest shadows than by people. Another account came from a nurse in Lexington. She recalled a girl who was brought in for treatment, a child who refused to remove the cloth mask that covered her face. The girl clutched it tightly, sobbing at the idea of anyone seeing what lay beneath. When the mask was finally lifted, even the hardened staff fell into silence. The deformity was profound, a cleft and collapse of the skull that told its own story of the bloodline's decay. Journalists, chasing rumors, began to piece the fragments together. They spoke to neighbors who remembered strange cries in the night, to teachers who once had children in their classrooms who didn't seem to belong to any family in town. Each witness gave only part of the truth, as though speaking the whole thing out loud was too dangerous. What struck outsiders most was the contrast. In an America racing toward modernity, television sets glowing in suburban homes, highways cutting through the South, there still existed families who seemed locked in another century. Trapped by secrets older than the nation itself, the discoveries blurred the line between folklore and fact. What locals once dismissed as mountain superstition now had faces, names, and court files attached. The patriarch was long gone by then, his shadow buried but not forgotten. Yet the damage he left endured in flesh and memory. The 18 children had grown, scattered, some vanishing into anonymity, others living out lives marked by physical and mental scars that could never heal. And as investigators dug deeper, one question became clear. How many more secrets still lay hidden in the Appalachian hills, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover them? When the story of the Kentucky patriarch finally seeped beyond the ridges of the hills, it did not arrive clean or whole. It arrived twisted, blurred, carried on the lips of those who had seen too much or perhaps imagined too much. And in that hazy space between witness testimony and folklore, the patriarch became something more than human. To some, he was remembered as a devil man. Neighbors whispered that he had struck bargains with dark forces in exchange for control over his sisters, that the twisted children were not just products of inbreeding, but of curses older than memory itself. Hunters swore that when they passed near the cabin at night, the trees themselves bent in strange directions, as though bowing to something unseen. Others rejected the supernatural explanations. They argued he was not a monster but a man, shaped by poverty, isolation, and ignorance. In their telling, he became a symbol of what can happen when the boundaries of community collapse, when silence and fear allow abuse to fester unchecked. The patriarch, they said, was no demon, only the worst reflection of what rural America had been capable of hiding. Scholars who later studied the case found themselves trapped in the same web of half-truths and myths. Was this family an anomaly, a grotesque accident of geography and circumstance, or were they a symptom of deeper wounds, generational trauma, economic abandonment, the crushing weight of life in forgotten corners of America? The debate itself became part of the legend, scholars dissecting fragments of testimony as though they were decoding scripture. But what could not be denied were the facts. There had been 18 children. There had been sisters who lived in silence, bearing child after child in the service of one man's will. And there had been a patriarch who believed he could create an empire sealed off from the world, bound by his own rules, untouched by law or morality. Even after the cabin collapsed and the family scattered, the memory refused to fade. The hills themselves seemed to absorb the weight of the story. Travelers who stumbled into the area said they felt watched. Children in town dared each other to whisper the patriarch's name, but never after dark. The tale lived on in two forms, as folklore, painted in fire and shadow, and as cold fact, written in the names and dates of court records and death certificates. Somewhere between the two lay the truth, but no one could ever quite separate them. And so the Kentucky hills became haunted, not just by superstition, but by memory. A memory that asked in silence, was this the work of one twisted man, or the shadow of a nation that chose not to look too closely? The story did not end when the patriarch was laid to rest. His children, and their children after them, carried the weight of his choices like an invisible chain. The scars were not always visible. No newspapers reported them. No court records captured them. But they lingered in silences, in hushed conversations, and in the way entire families seemed haunted by something they could not name. Some descendants fled the Kentucky hills as soon as they could. They changed their surnames, moved to distant cities, and worked tirelessly to erase every trace of where they had come from. In interviews decades later, one woman described the family history as a curse carved into our blood. She spoke with her hands clenched, her voice shaking, as if naming it aloud risked awakening something buried. Others stayed. They remained in the same sagging houses along dirt roads, unwilling or perhaps unable to sever themselves from the land that had raised them. For these survivors, trauma became a cycle. Poverty kept them rooted, silence kept them compliant, and memory, those faint half-spoken recollections of what had happened in the shadows, kept them afraid. Psychologists who studied rural isolation pointed to a phenomenon called intergenerational trauma. When the pain of one generation silently imprints itself on the next. In this family's case, the signs were unmistakable. Anxiety, alcohol abuse, the gnawing belief that they were somehow tainted, unworthy, marked by something their ancestors had done, but they never chose. Neighbors remembered hearing rumors whispered at church gatherings and in small-town grocery stores. One man recalled how children of the bloodline were avoided by classmates, as if shame itself could spread by touch. Another spoke of how some families locked their doors tighter at night if they knew one of them lived nearby. The trauma was more than psychological. It was cultural. These hills, like so many across rural America, had perfected the art of silence. Abuse was rarely named. Secrets were buried deeper than coffins. The community's instinct was not to intervene, but to avert its eyes. And so the family's pain festered, unspoken, reshaped with every generation that followed. Decades later, researchers returned to the region, hoping to unravel the myth from the truth. They found descendants who barely knew the details, but who confessed to an inexplicable heaviness in their lineage. "It's like living with a ghost," one man said, "and the ghost has your last name." Even those who escaped found themselves stalked by echoes. Some refused to have children, terrified of passing down the shadow. Others lived in constant fear that someone, somewhere, would discover who they really were. Identity for them became a battlefield, between the lives they built for themselves and the history they desperately wanted to bury. The patriarch's empire of silence had collapsed long ago. But the silence itself, the reflex to hide, to endure, to look away, lived on. And the question lingered: when a family carries trauma in its blood, can it ever truly be free of the past? The hills have a way of swallowing history. Cabins rot into the soil, wooden beams collapsing under the weight of moss and time. Paths once marked by boot prints vanish beneath the undergrowth. Yet some stories refuse to be buried. In Kentucky's backcountry, the patriarch's name is almost forgotten. His cabin, little more than a scatter of timbers reclaimed by vines, has disappeared into silence. But his presence lingers, whispered in low tones, carried from one generation to the next, like a warning no one dares to ignore. Local residents still point toward the ridge where the family once lived, their voices lowering as though afraid the woods might be listening. "It's gone now," one elderly man told investigators, gesturing toward a slope of tangled brush, "but you can feel it. That place, it don't rest easy." What remains today are fragments, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, testimonies warped by memory, and the physical traces of a lineage marked by secrecy. Each piece offers only part of the puzzle, never the whole picture. Scholars who attempted to reconstruct the truth found themselves entangled in contradiction. Was the patriarch a monster born of cruelty, or merely a desperate man shaped by poverty and ignorance? No record settles the question. What survives is something murkier, a legacy that straddles the line between folklore and fact. For folklorists, the tale became emblematic of rural America's darker undercurrents, a reminder that behind the nation's polished myths of family and frontier lay stories of unchecked power, of silence wielded as a weapon. One professor described it as a wound in the American story, small, hidden, but deep enough to poison generations. The legacy extended beyond blood. Investigators discovered that the family's presence influenced how neighboring communities saw themselves, suspicious, tight-lipped, distrustful of outsiders. Even now, locals warn children not to wander too far into the hills, not because of wolves or wildcats, but because the land itself carries memory, and memory has teeth. Visitors to the site speak of an atmosphere heavy with unease. One researcher described standing where the cabin once stood, surrounded by vines and damp earth, when the forest fell unnaturally still. "It was as if the place didn't want me there," she recalled, like the ground remembered what had happened. And so the patriarch's empire of silence, though his body has long since decayed, continues to echo. His children scattered, his home dissolved, his name erased. Yet the story he left behind outlives them all, stitched into Kentucky's folklore like a scar across the hills. The warning is clear, though few say it aloud. When blood binds too tightly, when silence shields cruelty, destruction is inevitable. But one final question lingers unresolved. If his name is forgotten, his face lost to time, what does it mean that his story still holds power? Perhaps the greatest legacy of the hidden patriarch is not the family he broke, but the shadow he cast. A shadow that refuses to die,